Our next presenter is named Professor Sabina Scheck. Sabina Scheck is an economist on the faculty at the University of Chicago in Public Policy Studies and the program on the global environment, where she teaches environmental economics and environmental policy. She is also a senior research economist at the Chicago consulting firm RCF Inc. Her research includes economics of climate change policy, markets for air and water pollution control, land use policy, and the valuation of benefits and costs from environmental policy. Her current research includes energy efficiency and the economics of green building, health valuation for urban air pollution, economics valuation of ecosystems, and market-based programs for Great Lakes conservation and restoration. Some of you may recognize her from last year's Summer Institute on Climate Change. Please join me in welcoming Professor Scheck.
Hi, welcome everybody, and thank you for being here. So as Jamie pointed out, I am an economist. Most of my work is in the area of environment and natural resources. That's not what my talk is about today, except you will notice that a lot of my examples are environment related, so hopefully that's of interest to people. So my talk is going to be completely different than Dave's talk, which I think is good. We're going to step back, way back, to just talking about markets. And the reason that I call this the case for markets is because I want to talk a little bit about why we even have markets and trade and globalization in the first place. How do we get here? And I'm going to approach this from a microeconomic perspective. I don't know what everyone's background here is. I'll ask you a few questions in a second. But really I'm going to be looking at sort of individual decision making and how, two people in this room could engage in a market transaction while I'm talking, right? So it is, stepping back to thinking about choices and behavior and transactions and trade and why two parties, whether they're individuals or countries, would engage in trade. So just to kind of step back from this whole, this encompassing entity of the global economy, which is sort of hard to grasp and understand and go back to where we started, in terms of markets and that. So the way that I prepared to do this is to give you the perspective. I know you're all actively working on curriculum, and I wanted to talk about sort of what are we teaching at an Econ 101 level? How is it presented in your standard textbooks, with a few twists and turns here and there, and hopefully learn a little bit too from you. What you're interested in teaching and how your economics courses might be structured or incorporated into your other curriculum. So the first thing that I wanted to ask everybody is, how many people here are economics teachers? Okay, so a couple of you. So for you guys, this stuff's going to be really basic. Hopefully not too basic. How many people have had an economics course? Okay, so almost everybody. How many people know the difference between microeconomics and macroeconomics? Okay, quite a few people. So as I said, this is going to be the microeconomics perspective. Dave mentioned that I might talk about exchange rates. I'm not going to. So the global finance, the exchange rates, the big macro picture, I'm going to leave that to the expert macroeconomists. I believe Robert DeYoung here is here on Wednesday, and that's his field. He'll tell you a lot more about that. So I'm going to do sort of Econ 101. I'm going to use a lot of graphs, so I hope everybody likes graphs. I find that to be a very useful teaching tool for students who don't like to see a lot of math, which isn't many students here at the University of Chicago, but there's sometimes you don't want to scare people off, and I've had many students tell me that, well, I don't like economics because of all the math. So other students then say, I don't like the graphs, I'd prefer to do it in equations. But really, we want to be intuitive about it. Somebody once said that economics was common sense made complicated. So we don't want it to be complicated. We don't want to scare anybody off. And that's why I thought I'd kind of, instead of approaching the big global economy, go back to what, sort of the intuitive feel for economics. One of the readings that I posted is this book by one of my colleagues, Charlie Whelan, who is a lecturer in the Harris School of Public Policy here. This is called Naked Economics, Undressing the Dismal Science. No math, no graphs, very intuitive economics. Basically, he writes about a lot of things, including his life here in Chicago and how on a day-to-day basis he incurs, trades and markets and the global economy and how all of these things come to be in a very intuitive sense. I highly recommend this. You might recognize his name as he also recently just ran for Congress for Rahm Emanuel's seat. He didn't win, but so that's a very good resource. I'll give you some more recommendations. I'd like to keep this as interactive as possible, so feel free to interrupt me at any time with questions. I'll have plenty of time, hopefully at the end, for questions as well. And likewise, I might stop and ask you for input and ask you questions just to get an idea of what level we're all at here and try to find the best one. So let me jump right in. So the case for markets, as I said. Why markets and globalization? What are there benefits of competition and trade? Well, certainly, and that's how we got to the point that we're at. One other thing that I should say about this is that I'm not going to try to make too many value judgments about markets, trade, and globalization. I think we're going to hear a lot of that as we go along, so I'm going to try to give you straightforward. This is why we have markets and globalization. There are obviously good aspects. There's obviously complications and limitations and all kinds of market failure, which I will talk about it as well. So what are the benefits of competition and trade? Well, the sort of main benefit from competition is that we have more choices. Okay, so when you go to the store, you can choose what you want to purchase. If we here in this room decided we're going to take a 1-hour break, everyone can go do what they want with their time for an hour. You're not all going to do the same thing. Right? You're all going to choose to do different things. Some of you will go buy a cup of coffee. You will go to the store and say, oh, it's $2 for a cup of coffee. Well, it's worth it to me, so I'm going to exchange $2 for this cup of coffee. The person on the other side of the counter is saying, well, it's worth it to me or to my employer to accept the $2 and give you this cup of coffee. Right? So you've both made a choice. You've both decided to engage in the transaction, and it was mutually beneficial. Okay, the next person may have no interest in getting coffee, and they go over and get a Coke, right? So one of the benefits of competition and trade is just that we have choices available to us. The other benefit is that competition tends to lower price, which contributes to rising incomes. This is the premise for economic growth, right? So Dave talked a lot about economic growth, and that's the basic premise for why we are interested in global markets and global economy, for rising incomes. Productivity. So competition will, in general, we believe, increase productivity and efficiency in the sense that it'll be competition to lower costs. And innovation, right? So if you need to compete with your competitors, that you will engage in better productivity and innovation. I'll give you an example at the end of the very relevant example of the U.S. Auto industry and competition and how that worked or didn't work for them. But with competition, necessarily creates winners and losers, right? If somebody's going to win, somebody has to lose. That's kind of the issue with a lot of this discussion. Does economics ignore the losers? Right? This is a question. So, I spend a lot of time trying to tell people that economists aren't necessarily trying to destroy the world or, they don't hate poor people or things like that. But whether or not economics deals with things very well is another question. So here's an example of how economics works. I hope this example works. Here's a big pie, right? Here's a small pie. So in most cases, we take the big pie over the small pie, all other things equal, right? Well, if you look at how the pies are split up, in the first pie, one person's getting a tiny slice and another person's getting a huge part of the pie. In the second case, it's an equal distribution, but it's smaller, right? So in this case, one person gets more and the other person gets less. Which one does the economist prefer? It's not a trick question. It's a bigger pie, right? So economics is about maximizing the size of the pie, not necessarily how it's divided up. So let's just assume, economists do this all the time, let's say that we can put a dollar value on these pieces of pie. Okay, so let's say that, in the first case, the little slice of pie is only worth $20 and the big rest of the pie is worth $480. So a total of $500 has been generated in pie, right? And in the second case, each person gets $100. So, the economists take the first one instead of the second one. Why would that be? Any thoughts? More opportunity, right? If you look at the first one, you've got $500 to work with. You could take $100 from this person who's getting the 480, give it to the other person. In that case, you'll have 120, 380. They both have more than they do in the second case. Okay, so the idea is as long as the pie is bigger, you should be able to redistribute and make both people better off than with the smaller pie. Okay, I don't know if that's too abstract an example or not. Does it get redistributed? That's another question. If we just look at this country, taxes are very unpopular, right? That's where economists wave their hand and say, okay, we're done. We've done this part. Now you guys go and redistribute and make everybody better off. Whether or not that happens is another question. But that's the equity versus efficiency. Economists are all about efficiency. As long as if we have more, we can redistribute and make people better. So that's the economic argument. It's a very positive argument as opposed to a normative argument, right? It's just a matter of the size of the pie. We don't talk about how it's broken up. Many economists do. Many economists don't. So that's kind of where we are with that. What is the study of economics? Okay, well, it's the basic premise is that our resources, any type of resources, land, labor, capital, natural resources, air, space, they're scarce. There are, in no sense do we have unlimited resources that everyone can have as much of anything they want. Okay, so related to that is, what one of our economists here, Milton Friedman, said, there's no such thing as a free lunch. Right? So this last quarter we were teaching a course where we provided lunch to our students every Wednesday, and they kept talking about, I love having free lunch. This is the best part of this quarter is free lunch. And I would tell them, well, there's no such thing as a free lunch. What do we mean by that? They're like, we're not paying for it. We're here. Any ideas? Why isn't it free? Yeah. Part of it a very hefty tuition. Right? So they are paying for it. Someone's making the lunch, right? Someone's supplying it. The other thing that I tell them is that, well, if you weren't here having lunch, you could be doing something else. Okay? So the main thing is that you have to give up something, whether it's money, time, or just your next best alternative, to be in the room having lunch. And this is really important for economics because we like to believe that we can assign economic value to everything, whether there's prices or not. So I tell the students, if you're going to take a day off on a nice day and go hang out at the beach, it's free. You don't pay anything to go to the beach. But there is something that we call a big opportunity cost, which is being in class and learning, or your tuition money that somebody pays for you to be there. So, you can all think about that right now. What is your opportunity cost of being here today? Well, the price is, sort of what you paid to be part of the institute. But it's obviously more than that, right? It's just the fact that you're spending 3 days here on all of your summer breaks, right? And so you compare that cost, the full cost, the price, the opportunity cost, to the benefit that you get from being here, right? Knowledge, credit, and networking, and curriculum, and all of those things. So there's an individual market transaction you're making, if you can kind of envision like that, comparing the benefits and costs of every decision you make. That can be from financial decisions, where to invest your money, to coming here today, to sleeping 1 more hour in the morning. Sort of everything weighs those benefits and costs. So what we say in economics is that individuals seek to maximize utility. Has anyone heard of utility as an economic concept? So utility is a very abstract notion. We can't measure it, we can't see it, but we can rank it. So we say that it's some measure of satisfaction. Okay, it's not exactly happiness. This is a big point of confusion because you get utility from going to the dentist. I don't know that you get happiness from going to the dentist, right? But in the long run, you get some benefit from going for regular checkups and cleanings and that. So that's kind of the distinction between utility and happiness. How do individuals maximize their utility? Well, they make choices. Okay, so we all make choices. Those choices are guided by our preferences. So we all have different preferences and different choices. And they're also constrained. Our choices are constrained by our income, our time, just accessibility, all of these different things that constrain us from making all the choices that we do. You are probably aware of the health effects and the cost of cigarettes, which are expensive, and you bring that against the benefit, the utility you get from smoking that cigarette, even though it may make you sick, right? So, you know, we consider people to be rational even if they're doing things that, you know, to you and I may not seem rational. And so that's where it's a little bit fuzzy over what's rational and what's not. But if people aren't rational, then we sort of lose a lot of our economic theory. So the other part that goes along with that and the rationality is that incentives can affect people's behavior. This is really important for policy, especially, you know, even to the extent of global policy, is that any incentives affect behavior. But economic incentives can also be a powerful tool for changing behavior in a policy setting. Okay, and I'll get back to that in a little bit. Economics tries to be positive, not normative. So, as I said, the pie, right? The size of the pie versus how it's broken up. It's not that easy to always be positive and not be normative, not be making value judgments about things. And for better or worse, economists try to make the positive decision and detach themselves from the normative. But, you know, one of my colleagues here in sociology says that the economists are only able to do that because they've all had lobotomies, but so they can't feel anything. But yeah, so you know, another one of my colleagues who I wanted to quote, but I don't think he's here yet, says that, well, economics has no morals. And I don't really argue with him because I think that's sort of true, that economics is not trying to have any morals, actually, right? So, and morals are subjective, so it's not a good framework for having morals. And as you can already see, this is where a lot of the problems come in with markets and trade and globalization. A lot of the things that Dave talked about, things you're going to hear about, that's where I think, you know, I tell my public policy students that economics is only one part of the decision rule, right? That it has to be combined with all of these, you know, Jamie said global economy is an interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary subject. So what I want to get into is, you know, how do we even get here? You know, the economists are big on trade, right? So going to the idea of specialization, some people have competitive advantages. Some countries have competitive advantages in certain things, depending on skills and resources, capital, incomes, and that trading can make us better off. And again, this is going to be very, very micro. So if we think about specialization, you know, some people choose to homeschool their kids, but others think that, well, it's, you know, teachers are specialized. They know how to teach. They are specialized in education, so I send my kids to school instead of homeschooling them, right? You know, if you're sick, you go to a doctor. A doctor specializes in medicine. And if you have a leak in your house, then you call a plumber. So it's a very, very basic idea that we specialize. We pay people to do things for us because they know what they're doing, and the opportunity cost of us trying to figure out how to fix plumbing is too high, right? So this is where this is the you know, very micro individual level of specialization, and this gets expanded up to a global scale, obviously, as countries produce things and trade. We have two types of advantage, and if you're an economics teacher, you probably heard this many times. If not, it may be new. Absolute advantage and comparative advantage. And the reason I bring these up is because I think that you have a handout, which is a trade example. Absolute advantage just means that as a country, you can produce more of a certain good than another country. Okay? That's easy. Comparative advantage means that you can produce more of a good and give up less of another good, so it's essentially an idea of opportunity cost. So it's not how much in total can you produce, but it's a question of what do you have to give up to do it? Okay, what do you have to sacrifice? And that becomes important with trade. So the main thing here is that specialization by comparative advantage, again, whether it's individuals or countries, can lead to mutually beneficial trades. This is the premise of trade. This is the premise of free trade. And, you know, I think the lines are pretty fuzzy. When we talk about markets and free markets, trade and free trade, I think all trade and all markets are regulated to some degree, but there's different degrees of regulation, and there's different spectrums when we talk about this. So if you want to take a look at the handout that I gave you, does everyone have one? So this, I don't know if you want to work through this yourselves, but I thought this is this is one example of what I give my students that I think could definitely work at at least high school econ levels. And this is just to show the very simple gains from trade. And I didn't put it up on the PowerPoint, but we can take a look at it. It's very simple in that it's a too good economy, right, which is completely unrealistic. But let's just say, for my students, I do this with roommates, and I'll take a student at University of Chicago and a student at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and one can produce term papers and one can produce cocktails, and then they trade back and forth. But I see that's not relevant. That's not very good for K through 12. So this is the too good economy gains from trade example between two countries. Okay, so if we want to go through this, the U.S. and Canada can produce baseball gloves and hockey sticks, that should say. What this table gives us, this first table, is the maximum that each country can produce. So for the U.S., for example, they can produce 100, these are millions, gloves or 50 hockey sticks, not both. Okay, and then we assume for simplicity that they can produce one or the other or some linear combination in between. Okay, and so if you look at Canada then, they can produce 90 gloves and 30 sticks. So right away we can see absolute advantage. Who can produce more of a certain good? The U.S. has an absolute advantage in gloves. Canada has an absolute advantage in hockey sticks. The country that has the comparative advantage is not necessarily the country that has the absolute advantage. It will be in this case, but it's not necessarily that case. So the first thing that we do is, this is actually, I do this maybe on the second day of class. So the first thing you do is say, okay, well, draw a country's production possibilities. Okay, we said that they can produce 100 baseball gloves or 50 hockey sticks. So they're just the endpoints on the graph. This means that if you look at the U.S. graph there, they can produce any combination on that line or inside the line, right? They can't produce outside the line. They can't, so in this case we're going to assume they consume whatever they produce before we get to trade. So they can't produce or consume outside the line without trade. They may be able to get to a point outside the line. The line might shift. What do you think might shift the line to give them more production possibilities? Yeah. Absolutely. So new technology, automation, you're not hand-stitching baseball gloves, that you can produce a lot more of them. So absolutely. Technology, rising incomes, lower input prices, whatever the case may be, you can produce more. One other very important assumption in economics is more is always better, right? More is preferred to less. So they wouldn't produce inside the line because they're not efficiently using all their resources. So if you look at the two production possibilities for the two countries, they look very different. Okay, so kind of go through this, I went through some of these already, but if you look at part number 4, the one thing we want to calculate is we want to know the opportunity cost, right? We said we want to think about comparative advantage. The opportunity cost of producing gloves, the opportunity cost of producing hockey sticks. So how you get these numbers is essentially just divide one by the other, but the opportunity cost of producing baseball gloves in the too good economy is how many hockey sticks you have to give up. So it's just moving along that production possibilities line. Okay, so for each country you can see, now the country with the lower opportunity cost has the comparative advantage in producing that good. Okay, so in this example, because the U.S., if you look at production of gloves, the U.S. only has to give up half a stick for each glove produced. Canada, on the other hand, has to give up 3 sticks for each glove produced. Why might that be so different? Just basically it's just specialization, right? Whatever you're better at producing, maybe they just train more people in Canada to produce hockey sticks, or maybe you're just more interested in it, or they have more trees to use for hockey sticks as wood. Whatever the case may be. And then, so we would say the U.S. has the comparative advantage in producing baseball gloves. And looking at the next line, Canada has the comparative advantage in producing hockey sticks. So in this case, the absolute advantage and the comparative advantage are the same. That's not always the case. We could have easily said the U.S. has the absolute advantage in both. But that doesn't mean that Canada shouldn't produce either of any, right? So that one of them may have had comparative advantage. So if we look down to the last table, let's just pick some points here. If you look at the second column before trade, U.S. producing 80 gloves and 10 sticks. That's a point on their production possibilities curve. For Canada, 18 gloves, 36 sticks. That's a point on Canada's production possibilities curve. We're saying there's no trade, they're going to produce what they can and consume whatever they produce. Okay? Now let's say that that's fine and all, but what if we have complete specialization? So U.S. makes only baseball gloves. Canada makes only hockey sticks. We know how many in total they can make based on those production possibilities curves. And then if we go to the active trade column, say that the U.S. says to Canada, well, we'll give you 19 million baseball gloves in exchange for 30 million hockey sticks. Okay, I just made up this example. There's a lot of combinations that would work. So they make this exchange, and now if you compare the after-trade consumption with the before-trade consumption, very simply you see that they both have more of each good. They've both moved outside their own production possibilities lines. Right, so if you go back to the graph and you plot those points, you would see that without the technological advancement that you talked about, just from this trade between the countries, they were able to get outside their production possibilities curve. That's economic growth. Okay, so it's a very simple example, but this is right here sort of the economist's basis for trade. And what we say is there's gains from trade. Right, so specialization, comparative advantage, gains from trade. Okay, it works fine in the very simple, too-good, made-up economy, right? We haven't at all talked about who's going to get the hockey sticks, who's going to get the gloves, or if somebody exploited labor to get those hockey sticks and gloves, or if industries are being moved abroad. None of that, but this is just the very basic framework. I usually find this a pretty good example for students to work through because they have to calculate opportunity cost, and they really struggle with that, actually. The opportunity cost is hard for them to grasp. Conceptually, it's very easy to understand. But actually calculating in this context, I find that they find it a little difficult, but once they're done with this example, say, okay, that makes sense to me now, I think. So, and I would think this seems on par for a high school class. I mean, you guys know better than I do, but, and this is very standard, so you might see it in some of your econ textbooks. I think even if you're not teaching economics, it's a pretty good way to communicate to students in other classes why economists like trade, right? And so why, we talk about free trade, why the WTO exists to facilitate free trade, because we hear a lot about why, globalization and trade cause disparities, but it's kind of the basic argument, it's a fundamental argument anyway, with why we start with trade. So any questions about that example? Pretty straightforward. I mean, it's a very simple example in the sense that the production possibility curves are probably not linear, right? They're probably nonlinear. There's probably diminishing returns and economies of scale and all of the other things that come into play. But I think that's the best way to work with it. Yeah? I think so. Yeah. The question was if you could pull one thing out of here for 8th graders, that would be easy for them to understand. It would be opportunity cost. It might be simple gains from trade, which you could do in a classroom and give them each a certain set of whatever they're trading and have them trade back and forth until they both have more of each. That may be a better way to do it. So moving on. Yes. Yeah, no, that's just for the example. It's probably, so that's a very good question. I mean, should you go with complete specialization, right? And it's probably a dangerous thing to do. So like take Venezuela, for example, right? And they've moved a lot of their resources to producing oil and exporting oil. They import 75% of their food. That's probably not a good economic situation to be in, especially as food prices go up. And so I wouldn't advocate complete specialization. And I think you tend to overuse resources, and it's good to be diversified for many reasons. But Detroit is another good example of complete specialization that didn't work so well. So yes, that's a good question. So competitive markets. What are competitive markets? And this is what we keep talking about. I think we all know markets are demand and supply, right? We have demanders or consumers. We have suppliers, which are producers. The example I gave for your cup of coffee, right? You go to buy your cup of coffee. It's $2, and you're comparing the price, $2, to what it's worth to you, its value, or how much utility you get from it. So that very first cup at like 6:30 this morning, when you went in to buy it, so $2, you might have been willing to pay $5 for that, right? So the second cup, it's still worth $2 to me. You get down to the third cup and you're thinking it's not worth $2 anymore. That's when you stop consuming. So you've consumed 2 cups of coffee at $2. That's important because what we say is that this value, the marginal benefit, we say it's at the margin, it's the incremental value from each additional cup of coffee, that's diminishing, right? Same with anything, pieces of pizza, all-you-can-eat buffet, not just food, but as you have more of something, each additional income, So an extra dollar to someone making $1 million is probably worth, it's not probably, is worth less to an extra dollar to someone making, $10,000. Okay, so each incremental unit, we say it's diminishing. So we've got the demanders, then we've got the suppliers, right? And so the coffee salesperson is saying, or the coffee company, that, thinking about how much it costs you to make that cup of coffee and to provide it, right? If someone's willing to pay me at least that much, probably more than that, then maybe it only costs me $1 to make it and provide it. And if someone's going to offer me $2, then I'll supply it. Okay, so it just goes in the opposite way. So price is the equalizing factor here between the demanders and the suppliers, right? And there's this mutually beneficial trade that they're about to make. So I think probably everyone has heard of the invisible hand. This invisible hand's under a lot of fire right now, right? So this is Adam Smith saying that get all these buyers and sellers together, or not buyers and sellers, even just individuals, and people are willing to engage in mutually beneficial trades. We're all trying to do something that's going to make us better off. So I'm going to buy coffee because it makes me better off. Starbucks is going to sell coffee because it makes them better off. We find each other, we come together. This is a market, right? The market is, this invisible hand that brings people together and results in some market equilibrium. Okay? The thing is that in order for that to be true, and Adam Smith, he did acknowledge this, that in certain circumstances, right? So these markets don't always work, right? We need certain things to be true in a competitive market, or some degree of it. Price takers is very similar to no market power, meaning that one individual, one company, one country can't control the price. Okay, it has to be this equalizing force that everybody's sort of facing the same price, or it doesn't work anymore. So a monopoly, for example, is not a competitive market. That's why market power is regulated through antitrust laws and insider trading and things like that. No government intervention. This one sounds kind of funny, and what you'll see is that government intervention is an assumption that's needed for a market, but it's also a source of market failure. It's also a correction for market failure. Okay, so the government's all over this. We'll get into this in a second. Perfect information. Do we ever have perfect information? Well, the argument is that if we didn't have, if that maybe we didn't know about something at the time we made the decision, and we found out later. Okay. The main thing about perfect information is that all the information that's available is accessible to people, and there doesn't have to be perfect information, but it should be somewhat symmetric. So insider trading is a violation of symmetric information. Right? One side has more information than the other. Okay, this is a big one for the global financial crisis. Information was a big one. From the perspective of the mortgage broker, they did their deal, they made their commission, and they were pretty much done. They had no idea where the mortgage-backed security went. They didn't care, right? So, there's this big chain where the information from one group to the next is kind of getting lost along the way. It's very disconnected. The other thing that pertains to a lot of the work I do on environmental work, but also I think to the housing or the mortgage crisis, no externalities are public goods, right? So a competitive market means that it works if all these things hold up. An externality is a situation where the individuals or the companies engaging in a market transaction create some additional cost or additional benefit to people who are not involved in the market transaction. Okay? So they're not recognizing this full cost. Can you think of an example of what that might be? Yeah. Pollution, right? So I'll give you an example about greenhouse gases later, but so when you're, pollution is probably the most common example. Smoking is another example. When you make a decision to smoke a cigarette, are you considering the effect of secondhand smoke on people around you, for example? When we turn on the lights, are we thinking about the greenhouse gas emissions? And we might be thinking about it, but it's not really reflected in the price. Okay, cigarettes are taxed pretty heavily. Greenhouse gas emissions, their cost is not reflected in. Right now it's not reflected. We'll get in there. So it's what we call a divergence between private and social returns. These can be costs, but they can also be benefits. So smoking and pollution are negative externalities. Can you think that's something that might generate benefits to people who aren't involved in the transaction? A positive externality? Yeah. Yeah, a park, for example. There's a real fine line here between positive externalities and public goods, which are shared resources. But a park is an example. You can also think of maybe your neighbor builds a beautiful garden, and you get to look at it and smell it every day. Right? That's a positive externality. Or the bees come and pollinate your flowers because they've attracted pollinators. That's a positive externality. Either way, negative or positive, there's a market failure. With a negative externality, too much of something's being produced. With a positive externality, too little of it's being produced than what society really wants. This is also, I think, important for the financial crisis is externalities, right? It's a divergence between private and social returns. So if we kind of think about, the private risk versus social cost, right? So for any individual involved in the transaction, this mortgage-backed security transaction, there's a private amount of risk, right? But the social cost of that risk is shared among many, many other people. So that full cost was not taken into account by this one decision maker, the mortgage broker, for example. Yeah. Exactly what they're talking about. Yep. So privatized gains and socialized losses, that's exactly what they mean by an externality. Yeah. So that's, these are all very important. Homogeneous goods means that, in a competitive market, everyone's providing the same good. This is just because if goods are different, then there may be preferences towards one or price differences. That's not as important because obviously product differentiation is very important. So, like I said, I do environmental economics. So I deal a lot with information, externality, and public goods. So when I teach my environmental econ course, I start with market failure, right? And so that doesn't mean that we throw out markets. We start with market failure, and what we talk about is how to restore market efficiency using economics. So we will get into that. This is probably something everybody has seen at some point in their life, whether they wanted to or not, that this is just a supply and demand model. Go back to this notion of marginal benefits and marginal costs, and what these demand and supply curves represent is the relationship between price and quantity. Okay, so you look at the price of something, you determine how many to buy. For some people it will be none, for some people it will be 20, right? It just depends on your preferences. And the demand curve is downward sloping because as price gets higher, you buy less of something, right? It represents your marginal benefit in that as your quantity, the amount you've purchased increases along this x-axis, the demand, the benefit is declining, okay, as we said before. Supply is the same as marginal cost. What's it cost the supplier to put this out on the market? And again, this doesn't have to be demanders and suppliers in the market. This can be somebody's individual decision. I'm weighing the marginal cost of sleeping one more hour against the marginal benefit it's going to give me. It can be very individual. So market equilibrium is where supply and demand are equal, right? So demand is equal to price, supply is equal to price. There's an equilibrium price and quantity. But that can change, right? Here's why we use markets, is that we can say that demand or supply shifts. As economists, what we try to do is predict what happens when demand or supply changes. That's important for public policy making because we may be interested in policy instruments that are designed to shift demand or supply. Okay, a gas tax, for example. We don't want to be arbitrary about a gas tax. Oh, $2 sounds like a good amount. We want to be able to predict a couple things with the gas tax. If you're a city, you might want to be able to predict how much revenue you're going to raise. But it's not quite that simple, right? Because if you are currently, selling 1 million gallons of gas and you put a $2 tax on it, you're not going to get $2 million in revenue, right? Some people will stop driving, or some people will drive less. So you want to predict how many fewer gallons will be consumed. So the reason I bring this up is because, for policy, you want to be able to predict what we call optimal prices. So if the goal of your policy of a gas tax is to reduce congestion, right, you want to reduce the number of cars on the road, you want to figure out, what's the optimal gas tax that will reduce traffic volume by 20%, for example. Maybe if you're a city, I want to figure out the optimal gas tax that will raise $2 million in revenue. Okay, and so you don't want to be arbitrary about it. It is arbitrary a lot of the time, but that's the role of economics in policy making here. So, for example, let's look at what happens if supply changes. Well, if supply shifts, what happens is we see a higher price and a lower quantity. This is a decrease in supply. It looks like it went up, but it's a decrease. It moves to the left. Or an increase in marginal cost. What could cause supply to shift? Input prices, weather. So there's the massive drought in Central America and the price of coffee beans goes way up. I keep using coffee as an example, but this was on my mind. So technology, can lower the cost of production. That would move supply the other way. What could shift demand? Let's say demand increases. Higher price and higher quantity. Income, economic growth, taste, prices of other goods, right? There's the idea that, with substitutes and complements. I'll show you an example with respect to electricity, that if we do have a carbon policy, right, and we raise the price of using coal, we want to, again, be able to predict what happens, right? Does everyone sit around in the dark? Or do people invest in energy efficiency and change their light bulbs? Do we switch to wind and solar? So these are all the types of things that we're trying to predict using markets. Okay, and so the market instrument here is a change in price, for example, or a change in any of these factors. Right, so if the government says, well, we want to push renewable energy, how can we do that? You can subsidize technology for renewable energy, right? Or you can put a price on carbon, which is proving to be a very difficult thing to do. So this is the role of economics. I'll show you some examples about how these work. Let's take global food prices, and this can be domestic food prices. I mean, we have a global market, right? Global commodity market. So let's first start with corn. Okay, the subsidy to ethanol blenders. Okay, so you remember when we were going to do something about our addiction to oil, and we decided to invest all of this money in corn-based ethanol. The subsidy went to the ethanol blenders. Corn is subsidized as well, so let's remove all the sort of farm subsidies for a second and say the subsidy went to ethanol blenders. So what does that do? That increases the demand for corn. Ethanol blenders found it, from there, if you were to look at a graph of ethanol and they got subsidized, their marginal cost just went down, right? And they're looking for more and more corn because they have the subsidy. Demand for corn goes up. What happens? The price of corn goes up. We saw that happen, right? That was very clear. But then we also saw, the price of soy went up, right? So soy could be any other agricultural product, actually. Why did the price of soy go up? Well, there's a couple different explanations for this. Higher price of corn diverted land from corn to soy. So farmers who rotate corn and soy stopped the soy rotation. Or they took land, I put up this other example of CRP, that's landing the Conservation Reserve Program. So that's a program by the USDA that pays farmers not to produce. Okay, takes land out of production, compensates farmers for not producing, and the land is idled for purposes of controlling soil erosion and pollution. So what happened, though, is all of a sudden this agricultural land became very profitable for corn. So land got taken, and that was just a side example, taken out of conservation because the price of corn per bushel then outweighed the price of the conservation payment, the amount of the conservation payment. Same with soy, right? So corn gets diverted, land gets diverted from corn to soy. This is the supply curve of soy shifts back. That's why we see the price of soy go up. Okay? What about milk? What does milk have to do with corn? Exactly, right? So corn is feed. Grain is feed for dairy cows. So what we saw happen is that now the input price to producing milk just went up. That shifts supply back. Price of milk goes up. Okay, so this is, in some people have said this is a good thing because now people will stop feeding their corn to dairy cows and using it for better, higher uses and feed grass to dairy cows, which is better for greenhouse gas emissions, actually. But the main point is that milk got more expensive. So this is sort of the relationship. This is the effect, direct and indirect effect of the ethanol subsidy. The question for economists, could we have predicted these impacts? Yes. Did anyone ask? No. But yeah, we could have predicted these impacts. The scientists could have predicted environmental impacts. We know, we have these tools, we think, to say that, well, if you give an ethanol subsidy of, so much, that 39 cents, say, per gallon or whatever, we can predict using these markets and these demand and supply models and everything else that the demand for corn will increase 20%, 50%, say. From that, we can predict the effect on soy. We can predict the effect on milk. There's always uncertainty. Obviously, there's always uncertainty. But that's what economists have been doing forever. So could we have predicted the magnitude of these impacts? Probably. At least to some degree. We might have been wrong. We might have been off. But, that's the role of economists in markets, really, is that we can inform public policy to say, look, this is what's going to happen, right? It gets complicated, though, when you have global markets. It gets really complicated. And, you have to think about how it's going to affect other countries and other decisions. And food aid, how this affects food aid. We start using corn for fuel, right? So there's a lot of implications here. But this is, so the question is how do we do this? How do we predict these impacts? Well, we have two tools in economics that we think are pretty useful. I don't know how easy this is to communicate to students, but I think intuitively it's something that could be addressed, is that first we have something called elasticity. Okay, so elasticity measures the relationship between price and quantity. So if we say we're going to raise the gas tax by $1, or say we're going to raise it by 1%, we can predict the amount, the demand for gas will decrease by 2%. That measures elasticity. Okay, so it's the sensitivity of either the quantity demanded or the quantity supplied to price. Okay, very important from a policy perspective, right? And that just requires having data on supply and price and quantity, which for any kind of market good we have. I deal a lot with, when I deal with environment, there aren't very good markets for environment. So having data on price and quantity, there's a whole bunch of other ways we have to do that. But for generally, for things like corn, it's pretty easy. And so that's what it does, right? Elasticity measures how much demand or supply change for 1% change in price. And it doesn't have to be change in price. We could see what happens when you change income. We could see what happens when you change the price of other goods. So we can predict if we raise the price of using coal or oil, what's going to happen to wind, solar, other technologies. That again is complicated though, right? We could say, okay, well, if we raise the price of coal, we know that it costs this much to generate wind, but we haven't yet figured out how to get the wind from South Dakota to Chicago, right? So you have to consider the entire market. You have to consider the global market, right? And so what's going on in other countries. Other countries are farther ahead of us in generating technology for wind turbines and things like that. So then you've got the import and the export to think about as well. So that's our first tool, is elasticity. The other one is something we call welfare measurement. This isn't traditional welfare in the traditional sense. This is measuring value. So remember I said that first cup of coffee was worth more than $2 to you. But the price you paid, what we observe you paying, is $2. But what we're saying is it's worth more. The way you measure this is essentially you paid $2, maybe it was worth $5. The extra value to you is what we call consumer surplus. Right? And this is important, again, when you deal with things that don't have a market price. So, going to the beach for a day. Your market price is zero. It doesn't mean it's worth zero, obviously, or you wouldn't have done it. Right? So, consumer surplus is a measurement of value. It's a bit abstract. If you look at the demand curve, remember we said your demand curve represented your marginal benefit from something. And you're going to keep purchasing up until the price is equal to your marginal benefit. Beyond that, its value to you is worth less than price. That's why you stop consuming. So the expenditure, say you're purchasing Q star here, the expenditure is P star times Q star. That's how much you spent to purchase this good. The extra value to you, though, is represented as this area under the demand curve above price. It's the extra value for each unit, and we can see it's diminishing, right? It's abstract because it's hard to measure, right? Unless we have observed like your purchases at every different price level. But generally we have a lot of market data that we can track different price levels and estimate a demand curve. The same thing happens with supply, and we call it producer surplus. These are what we call welfare measurements. The reason this is important is because if you remember, supply represents marginal cost, demand represents marginal benefit. So in a sense, this area is measuring what we call net benefit. It's the total cost minus the total benefits. Okay? I realize this might not be exactly straightforward right now. The market, though, efficiency requires that we maximize this net benefit. If, say, you decided to stop purchasing before Q star, okay, at some point before Q star, what that would indicate is you're not capturing all of that benefit. That triangle area would be cut off somewhere before there. If you went beyond Q star, remember, supply is cost, demand is benefit, you're taking a loss. Cost outweighs the benefit. That's why this is the efficient spot, okay? Mathematically or graphically, if supply is marginal cost, then it's the cost for each unit consumed. So if you add those all together, you get total cost, or graphically, it's the area under the supply curve is your total cost. Similarly, because demand is marginal benefit, or the benefit from each one of those units consumed, the area, if you add them all up together, under the demand curve represents total benefit. And the difference between total benefit and total cost is this area, is what we call net benefit. So economics, we use markets. Sometimes we're not really talking in the world of supply and demand. We're talking in terms of, you've heard of cost-benefit analysis, or benefit-cost analysis. Right? The U.S. government has to do these benefit cost analyses of different types of programs. And so the EPA, when they want to change the pollution standards for ozone or something, they have to do a benefit cost analysis. And that's essentially, we're trying to maximize benefits over costs. Again, we're trying to maximize the size of this pie, if you remember. And Jamie, I forgot to start the timer, so someone's keeping me up to date. So, sorry. So why is this important? Well, market failure then means we're not accomplishing that triangle area. We're somewhere beyond the Q star, or we haven't gotten to Q star. For whatever reason, this market didn't result in this efficient condition. It didn't maximize net benefits. Why? Well, in an otherwise efficient competitive market, the following can cause market failure. Government intervention. Government intervention can come in the form of price controls or quantity controls. I'll show you a couple of examples of those. So if you set up a market, you want the market to work and achieve these maximum net benefits. If you do something like put a quota or price floor or price ceiling, you restrict price from kind of moving back and forth, then you end up with a situation where you're not going to get that net benefit. Subsidies and taxes as well. I'll come back to these in a second because we're going to show how these can induce market failure or can correct market failure. Market power, the loss of competition. So if you remember the assumptions of a competitive market, this is just when they don't hold up. Okay, so imperfect information, externalities, and public goods. Okay, so I'll give you an example. Sometimes you hear, why don't people support minimum wage? Why don't economists support minimum wage? I mean, it's not because they don't want people to have income, right? Obviously, economists believe in income. Yeah. It creates a surplus. Yeah. Yes. So it interferes with the invisible hand of the markets, but what does that mean? What is the outcome of that? That's what I'll show you here. So say this is a labor market, okay? Again, very, very simplified. This is no minimum wage, right? P star, market equilibrium wage $5. Quantity, this is the quantity of labor. You can think of it as number of people. You can think, well, actually no, you can think of it as hours of employment because this is minimum wage or wage on this graph. Let's say that the minimum wage is put in. Okay, the minimum wage is a price floor, meaning it's the lowest you can charge for something. Okay, the lowest you can pay for something. Price floor, what happens at a price of $6, if you look at your market, the quantity demanded of labor is 80, however many millions of hours. The quantity supplied, 115. So as you said, this is a surplus. What does a surplus mean in the world of employment and labor? It means unemployment. Okay, that's the very basic premise for, you know, why is a minimum wage inefficient? The argument is that it creates unemployment. Has this been proven in the economic literature? Yes. Has it been disproven? Yes. So you see the basic market argument against the minimum wage. The second part of that is sometimes people say, well, a minimum wage raises consumer prices. So, well, oh sorry, I forgot about this. This is showing you that in this market for labor, you're going to have a quantity of 80, right? The rest is surplus, it's unemployment. That little triangle is what we could quantify and say is the loss because it's not, you know, part of that net benefit that's been maximized. What happens if you look at consumer goods now? The cost of labor just went up. That's an input price. Supply shifts back, prices of consumer goods go up. Okay? So the theory is that minimum wages can lead to employment and less affordable consumer goods. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Or, you know, what the result is, economists aren't saying. They're just saying that this is a welfare loss to society because you're not maximizing net benefits. You know, does the getting people out of poverty outweigh this? You know, that's what all the research is about. But that's the basic argument. Another argument, this is a rent control. This is a price ceiling. It's different. A price ceiling means you can only charge less than the market price. So we don't have a surplus in this case. In this case, the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied. We have a shortage, a housing shortage. And in New York, where they have rent control, they also have black markets for housing. You pay $800 according to the law, and then you flip your landlord a little bit more to keep your apartment, right? So that's kind of one of the results of another example. Another source of market failure, externalities, right? And so I talked a little bit about this. If we compare, you know, what are the costs and benefits of generating electricity for a power company? They're not thinking about pollution, right? But the power company is not entirely the problem. Consumers, right? Are we thinking about pollution when we purchase electricity? We might be, but are we paying for it? No. So, you know, who bears the cost of pollution? It could be the producers. The producers and consumers are bearing the cost of pollution as well as everybody else. How do you get this into the private decision-making process? We have to do something called internalize the externality. And that we can do through many different ways. So we just said the market fails. So why would we ever want to come up with a market-based solution given the market just failed? Well, because we know from all those predictions we make, we know how to influence price and quantity, right? And incentives and behavioral changes, elasticity, all that stuff helps us do this. So we know incentives work. People respond to changes in price. Sometimes I say, people say it's very cynical, right? That we should be able to appeal to people's conscience. Well, that's true. I mean, I think both are necessary, absolutely. But, you know, a lot of people talk about climate change, and people got out of their cars when gas was $4 a gallon, right? So price is a very, very powerful tool for creating behavioral changes. The government can use this, and so we just said, wait a second, we just said minimum wages and rent control were sources of government market failure. But let's say the externality case, right? That we have a market failure from pollution. We can use the government, we can use a tax, for example, so that the price of pollution goes into the private decision-making process. Okay, so in this case, the government intervention can restore market efficiency. We can do it through price instruments. We know the quantity adjusts. Or we can do it through a quantity instrument, like a quota, knowing the price will adjust. Something else that we can use has anyone heard of the Coase theorem? Ronald Coase was a law professor here. He's still alive, but in 1960 he wrote a very important article called The Theory of Social Cost. And he won Nobel Prize in Economics. He wasn't an economist by training, but he won, basically saying that all the government needs to do, doesn't need taxes, is establish property rights. Give somebody the right to pollute or the right to clean air, and then one party can pay the other. They can negotiate back and forth and come out with these solutions. This is what this cap and trade model is based on. This is what the government going in and telling farmers, we'll pay you not to pollute. How much you're willing to accept, right? Government's acting on behalf of all the victims of pollution. So in this sense, the polluters were being paid. But the amount they were being paid was less than the damages we were suffering. So it made sense for the government to pay them not to pollute. And it made sense for the farmers because at the time, the payment they were getting was worth more than they could have gotten in production of corn or whatever else. That's essentially the Coase theorem. I'm going to... Well, I wonder if I should skip this. I think I have time, just quickly. So the example that I give my students on this is a very, very simple example. It becomes much more complicated again. But let's take two, apartments in Hyde Park. You can rent a one-bedroom for $800, a two-bedroom for $1,400. So if you've got two potential roommates, Sally and Jim, they say, okay, well, we can each get our own apartment for $800, or we can share and each save $100, right? And aside from sharing, they really don't have any issues of sharing. To them, just assume it's the same as living alone. Maybe they get more space that compensates. But the problem is that Sally smokes. And Jim says, well, I would do it except that your smoking costs me $150 a month in dry cleaning and an air filter and just discomfort. So the question I ask my students is, if that's the case and they want to live together, here are their options. If they could live alone and they each pay $800. They could live together and they each pay $700, but now Jim is paying $150 in damages. So if you look at the outcome, Sally's gained $100, Jim has lost 50. Right? So the question I ask my students, can they still live together? Pretty simple, right? Yes. Well, Sally says, otherwise if I don't live with you, I'm going to pay $800. So to me, anything between any gain I can get would make me better off, right? So say that Sally's saying, I'll pay you something between $0 and $100 to compensate you. And Jim says, I'm willing to accept, anything greater than $50 so that my gain is positive. So what it works out, if we take $75, now, if they live together, Sally pays $700 in rent plus $75 to Jim, right? Jim pays $700 in rent plus the $75 he gets from Sally. Then they have a net gain. It's the deal is that there's $150 in smoking compensation. Jim is going to be better off with the compensation payment. So this is a very simple example. This is where it gets more complicated, right? So here's the example with externalities is if anyone's been paying attention, we're talking a lot about cap and trade. Have you heard about that, cap and trade for carbon? We have a cap and trade program for sulfur dioxide that was established in 1990 under the Clean Air Act. What it did, we were already regulating sulfur dioxide. But in 1990, we decided we could actually reduce SO2 emissions the same amount for a lot lower cost if we had this market-based solution. Recognizing that people are trying to make themselves better off, they're trying to minimize costs. If we allow them to engage in these mutually beneficial trades, we can still reduce sulfur dioxide at a cheaper cost. So let's do it for CO2. There's a million different reasons why SO2 and CO2 are not the same and why one won't work as well as the other. But according to economics, what we know, cap and trade means you restrict the quantity of greenhouse gas emissions. We call it a quantity instrument. The price of you need a permit to emit pollution. Okay, it's called an allowance or a permit. The price of that permit really just depends on the market. Or we can go the other way and say, hey, let's just do a carbon tax. So we set the price of CO2, and then you can decide how much to produce, right? Given the flexibility is what makes it cheaper. You can either go about it quantity or price. In theory, they should be exactly the same, given our market that we saw with price and quantity. In reality, this is not what this talks about, but I can give you a million reasons why they're not the same, and why economists like a carbon tax over cap and trade, but whatever. So what are the substitution effects we can predict, right? So we know there'll be a supply response, right? If you're a power company, all of a sudden coal became more expensive. Oh, well, you're going to switch to wind, solar, carbon capture, all these things we're talking about. If you're a consumer, your energy cost just went up. Your electric bill just went up. What are you going to do? Energy efficiency. Switch your light bulbs. Buy energy efficient appliances. Conserve. Real-time pricing. So we can predict supply and demand responses. We should be able to do this pretty effectively. A market could work. But I can tell you right now that the market that they're going to establish, it's not going to be an efficient market, right? So the scientists have given their recommendations, the economists have given their recommendations, the political outcome is going to be somewhere way below what those two recommendations were. That's where we run into a danger of imposing a market where we don't have those assumptions of a competitive market. This cap and trade market could fail because we're going to restrict price and quantity, for example. Right? We're going to set up other policies like a renewable energy portfolio on top of a market. There's all kinds of reasons why this market will fail, and then it's not to assume that the market for CO2 is impossible. It's just that a market doesn't work unless you really comply with those market conditions. Okay? So economics doesn't always make good politics. Science never makes good politics somehow. Does the cost theorem work for pollution? Sure. We just gave the example with the Conservation Reserve Program. So lastly, sorry, I know I went longer than I meant to. Some examples from global markets. This is a good one, I think, from Charlie's book. So in the 1980s, right, the U.S. auto companies started having increased competition from Japanese automakers. So they had to respond. What they could do, here's the benefit of trade and globalization, is that the competition was for more fuel-efficient cars. So the U.S. auto companies could have responded by making more fuel-efficient cars, competing with the Japanese on the world global market. Or they could have lobbied the government for tariffs and quotas and for not having any new fuel economy laws for 30 years. Right? So this could have been a success story for globalization, right? And so globalization has all kinds of problems, but there is a reason why we want it as well, right? We want some components of it. You don't want it to be something that makes people worse off by any means. That's not the point. And it's definitely a side effect, though, but this could have been a good outcome. Ethanol, again, we saw that corn-based ethanol didn't turn out to be a great idea, environmentally or economically. For some people, economically, right? But Brazil has a competitive advantage in producing ethanol, right, from sugar cane. There's a huge tariff on it to bring it in the U.S. It's obviously a sticking point with the WTO and trying to get around that. But so what if we drop the tariff on Brazilian sugarcane ethanol? If our goal was really to get off oil, but that could have negative impacts as well. So in Brazil, then they suffer the impacts of trying to divert more land to sugarcane. Where do you think that land comes from? Rainforest, yeah. So, or from other agricultural products that increases the price of food in Brazil. So that's a complication, right? We haven't figured this one out at all. The Kyoto Protocol is another example of globalization. So within the Kyoto Protocol, this is the agreement on climate change that all of these countries signed on to, except the U.S., but most, other generators of greenhouse gas emissions signed on to it. But China and India signed on. They're part of this agreement, but they don't have any emissions reduction requirement. Why would that have been the case? They wanted to catch up, right? Meaning, okay, so maybe China has now overtaken us in greenhouse gas emissions. We can look at cumulative emissions, though, something very different. But they're developing countries, right? And so the argument is that, well, here's specialization, right? We've been controlling pollution for a long time in this country. We should have a specialization in pollution control technology. We know how to do it. We've already retrofitted all of our refrigeration plants. We've gotten rid of CFCs in this country. We should be able to go into China and do that really cheaply. So that's what's called the clean development mechanism, or the Kyoto Protocol, is that European countries, because they've done all that cheap stuff, right? They're at the point now where I got to build wind farms, and that's really expensive. I do carbon capture, which costs a fortune. Or I could go as a European country, go into China, pay for the refrigerant plants updates, which costs 1/1000th of building a wind farm, and still reduce greenhouse gas emissions by the same amount, or a comparable amount, say. Okay, that's what the clean development mechanism and the carbon market in the European Union allows them to do. The theory is that it doesn't matter where you reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The problem is, there's a million problems with that. One is a big thing that they call additionality. You want to make sure that China wouldn't have done that already. You want to make sure that these are additional greenhouse gas emissions. And that now that Europe's going to do this, will China just wait and say, well, if someone's going to pay for our pollution reduction, we'll just wait for that to happen. Right? There's all kinds of issues associated with that carbon market. There's also this idea, we talk about elasticity, income elasticity of environmental protection. So the premise is that as India and China begin to develop, they get higher incomes, then they can afford more pollution control technology, and that, you know, preferences for environmental quality tend to go up with income as well. So that's kind of the argument. So there's another good example of globalization that's somewhat worked, somewhat not worked. You know, the idea of the global climate treaty should be, or at least this part is based on globalization. There's so many politics involved, I don't know if it'll happen. But just to give you, you know, so in terms of just markets and how to model these things, this book I think is fantastic. I would highly recommend it. Even just for pleasure reading, really, you know, if you can make economics pleasurable, this book can do it. The Economist is just a great resource in economics. It's a great book, I think would be great examples too. This next one is a plug for a friend of mine who just started this resource. It's called the Climate Community. For those of you interested in the environment, it's a website that's designed specifically for K through 12 educators and students. And so there's a lot of resources on there for students to communicate with students at other schools around the world, and environmental clubs and school projects. There's cash rewards for environmental competitions for students and clubs that they want to get involved in. So if that's of interest to you, I think that's a really, it's just started, but I think it's a pretty good resource. And I think they've already had a few contests. They had an environmental essay contest for third graders, which was fun to read some of those articles. And so that's, I think, a great resource, and they're certainly looking for input from teachers as well on that. So, okay, sorry, it took a lot longer than I thought, but any questions about anything? Sure. So the question was, you know, why do economists think carbon taxes are better than a cap and trade market? One is that it's really not good in a business setting to have uncertainty about cost and price. So if you were to, you know, with the cap and trade program, what it does is it restricts the quantity and it lets the price adjust according to the market. This is the price of a carbon permit or an allowance. So say you were going to invest in a large-scale carbon capture facility, and you could get credits for that, and then you could sell those credits on the market. If you don't know what those credits are going to be worth, then you're going to be really reluctant to invest in that. If you're guaranteed through a carbon tax $50 per ton, reduced, you'd be much more likely to invest in something like that. And in Europe, the first round of permits that they gave out way too many, and the price went to zero. So nothing happened, right? So they had to kind of redo it. There's all kinds of reasons, something called offsets. So in this case, you can get credit towards reducing pollution by paying for it somewhere else. It's a pretty good economic argument, right? So you can pay a farmer to engage in no-till agriculture, and you get credit towards emissions reductions you didn't do. The idea is that it's cheaper to reduce emissions somewhere else. The problem is some of that, the verification gets difficult. right? And so knowing if that actually happened, or if you paid to plant trees somewhere, if that actually happened, that farmer may have already been doing no-till agriculture, or been planning to do it because there were enough private benefits associated with it, but now they're waiting. One thing that happened in China with this offset is that so China recognized that it's very profitable for European companies to come in and pay for pollution control in China. So they started taxing foreign pollution control investment. But taxed it enough, this is very smart, taxed it just enough so that it was still profitable for European companies to come do it, even with the tax. But now China's making money off its own pollution. That's what we call moral hazard. It's a very dangerous position to be in. Same with these offset projects. You don't want to think that people are generating pollution to get paid to reduce it. So there's a lot of strategic behavior that can go on. The other big thing with these carbon markets is they haven't decided. First they were going to give out all the allowances, right, for free, which is what we did with the Clean Air Act. And then Obama said, no, 100% auction. You have to buy every single permit to pollute CO2, which essentially shifts all the property rights to the government. Huge source of revenue for the government, right, that they could use to invest in renewable energy and public transportation. But the political fallout from that is pretty strong, so they may end up giving most of them away, and that's another big issue about what's going to happen with that. So I guess the argument for carbon tax, in my mind anyway, the argument is just simpler. And there's more certainty in price. You can't fix the problem with the carbon tax is you set the price and the quantity can move around, right? With greenhouse gas emissions, that's not quite as big a deal as if it was like lead or mercury or something really toxic. So if the quantity is off a little bit, you could adjust the tax. But you can't say the word tax in a political setting. The thing that's unfortunate is that in theory, according to our theory and all other markets, the cap and trade is going to do the same thing as the tax in terms of raise people's energy prices, but I don't think people fully understand that. So, yeah.
Can you comment on futures markets and how any of these government interventions, if the decision is made, it's immediately reflected in the market because of futures?
Yeah, and so this is something that I think Professor DeYoung can speak more about, but that's not only when the decision is made, but during the political process by which we're expecting something to happen. And so this is exactly what's been happening in carbon for a long time, is the anticipation of something happening. And that's a big issue that we got with the speculation and the oil prices as well, is as soon as you expect something to happen, you see all of this activity, all this market behavior that's going to cause, these prices to skyrocket because of that element of it. Yeah, so that's a big concern that probably needs better regulation or more efficient regulation in the speculative behavior and that. So I don't know. I mean, Obama talked about cracking down on speculators with respect to oil, but I don't know how that's gonna happen, or if it's gonna happen. So here's the big difference. In a mandatory market where you have to reduce emissions, we could expect the price of a carbon offset to be about $30 a ton. In this voluntary market where people are just doing it because they want to, that price is like $1.50 a ton. It's not a really great investment. But they've also, I think, expanded to other types of pollution like nitrogen and to protect groundwater and things like that. But yeah, so I don't know what's going to happen with the climate bill that's in Congress right now, but I'm not really optimistic. Other questions? Sorry. Okay. Thank you.